This round is being recorded. You guys are all aware of that?
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Tell me about this. This is not.
Oh, yeah, this is not, these do not necessarily represent our political views or affiliations. If this is used when one of us is running for office in like 30 years. Okay. Is everyone ready? Just about? Partner ready?
Yeah.
Okay. As I begin the first speech of the affirmative team and of the debate, I'd like to thank everyone for making this debate possible, my partner, my opponents, as well as, of course, the judges, and anyone who's in the audience out there, however many years from now. So the motion that we're debating is the United States federal government should end its military aid to Colombia. Now, as a little bit of background information and I guess definitions, the military aid currently is going to be $30 million in the fiscal year 2013. This has been reduced by $7 million from 2012 budget. This is according to Colombia reports forecast after the 2013 budget presentation on February 13th from the White House. This is, now as a little bit of background information, Colombia has received more aid from the United States since the year 2000 than any country outside of the Middle East. Between the years of 2000 to 2006, it totaled $728 million. Now, going into a little bit of resolutional analysis, I'm sure we can all agree that this is a policy resolution because the actor and the use of the word should indicates that there's a call for action. So as such, the judging criteria ought to be net benefits. Now I'm going to have two on-case arguments and I'm going to jump straight into them. So the first one is of unethical use of funds. ColumbiaReports.com reports that the U.S. has funded with this money more than 300 paramilitary and police groups, some on our own terror list of the United States and some off of the terror list that have been responsible for civilian killing since the year 2000. And the Colombia Attorney General actually estimates the number of civilian deaths as a result of these groups that we've been funding to be 2,000 deaths at the least. Yes?
Can you give a couple examples of some of the specific groups we actually have been funding?
Well, given the 20 minutes of prep time, I didn't actually get down any of the names of the groups, but most of them are regional military and police forces, and so the groups that are associated with their military and with their police. I don't know the specific names of them. They're probably something along the lines of like Colombia Police Force from this area. I don't know. As well as other human rights violations like rape and torture. So the United States is basically responsible for funding the deaths of innocents and the dehumanization of the victims of rape, of torture, and even the families of those who have lost their lives or have been scarred by these occurrences. So basically what we can see right now is that we have been supporting a police and military reign of terror. Because of the money that we're giving to Colombia, they're able to fund these expenditures, which are largely for the use of preventing the growing of cocoa, coca, which has not actually even been successful. But we're not really going to focus on that in our case. What they've been doing is accusing people of a crime, raping the person, or torturing the person, or killing the person, and we actually have a big figure on the deaths. And the plain text of ending the military aid to Colombia will end all of this aid and the hypocrisy of funding groups that are even on our own terror list and giving the U.S. increased legitimacy internationally. The plan defunds human rights violators, these organizations that have been accused of human rights violations, and upholds the sanctity of life, which is something really important to the United States federal government. You'll see that even in debate rounds, we oftentimes have motions as to, is the death penalty okay? Is it okay to fund this group? Is it okay to fund that group? Should the United States militarily intervene? Should the United States send drones here, here, and here? And one of the things that comes up repeatedly is the loss of life and is the sanctity of life, because that is such an essential part of our United States federal government social contract with its people. And the fact is that this isn't just an issue of the United States international relations, but because we, the citizens of the United States, are funding this military aid to Colombia through tax dollars and through debt that's going to be incurred on our future generations, which I'm going to get into in our second contention. We're seeing that they're violating the social contract of the United States by using our tax dollars to promote violence abroad, and not just to promote violence for a means to improve the lives of American citizens, but rather they're directly responsible for the deaths and mutilations of the lives of innocent civilians. And so by taking away this funding, not only would we no longer be funding unethical expenditures, but this would now be an opportunity to research ends to corruption, violence, and terror, which we're not able to do in Colombia right now because we're currently giving them the money that's supporting this. So if we take away this money, we can see that there might be political capital to spend on things that might seem counterintuitive to our goals right now as a country. Are there any questions on that first contention? Okay, so going into our second argument of debt and the social contract in the United States. Right now what we can see in the United States is that we have $16.4 trillion of debt. The latest WhiteHouse.gov budget forecast, adjusting for inflation, predicts that the debt will be about 200% of the GDP by the year 2084. Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, stated that future generations will see a standard of living decrease of 14%, which is the largest standard of living decrease we've seen since the Great Depression. And we can see that if we're going to put future generations into another Great Depression, we're going to see the same impacts, which are loss of jobs, loss of economic prosperity, loss of standard of living. We're going to have increased rates of death and poverty. Yes?
How can you claim all these very, very large impacts when in fact the amount of money we give to Colombia, as you stated yourself, is only in the tens of millions of dollars?
I'm not attributing all of the impacts of this straight to the $300 or the $30 million that we're giving to Colombia in this year. That would be ridiculous. What I'm trying to give is some background information and some context that we're able to use when we're talking about whether or not this is a just thing for the government to be doing. So this is just background information right now. These are my harms. So and this is all going to be a result of the intergenerational debt transfer. So we're basically accumulating this gigantic debt, and since we're not paying it off right now, we're pushing it onto future generations. And then we have a little bit more of analysis. So we can see that the Brookings Institute also stated that these individuals of future generations will have 2 times the lifetime tax burden. So we're really pushing this all onto our children, onto our grandchildren, onto our great-grandchildren. And we also see that since they are not represented when they're incurring when they're incurring this debt, and they're not represented for the debt that they have to pay off through taxation, we see that we're violating the American ideal of taxation with representation, because we are taxing people without the representation because they're not even born yet. So we see that this ideal that is part of our American social contract, part of one of the ideals that we've been giving our lives for as a country since the creation of our nation, is going to be completely violated. Now, what we can see when we relate this to the judging or to the resolution is that when we can see that the fact that the government is using military aid to Colombia as another excuse to incur this enormous debt, any action that is increasing the debt right now unjustly and on balance to a negative disadvantage to the United States is not just, and it is responsible for all of these impacts. Anything that we use to continue to incur this debt, to continue to prevent balancing the budget and encouraging bipartisanship in response to the debt to save the future of our country, is responsible for this. So for all these reasons, I urge a vote in favor of the affirmative. Thank you.
Medellin, Colombia was once a popular surfing destination before the 1980s. Since then, it has been one of the major crime centers in our world today. And there was a famous saying during the 1980s, what are the 3 most dangerous cities in the world? The 3 Bs, Bogota, Beirut, and Baghdad. Simply put, Colombia was once in a state of anarchy, and that is no hyperbole. Drug cartels, namely Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel, had so much influence that they could in fact afford to buy out the votes of members of Colombian Congress. They assassinated the head of the Justice Department when he actually began prosecuting these people. Colombia was in a state of anarchy that reminds us of the state that is going on south to our border in Mexico, but it was far worse than that. And to this day, Colombia sees and faces many, many security problems, and that is why we provide them so much significant military aid. So keeping this spirit in mind, I will first go into refuting my opponent's contentions before then moving on to our own off-case arguments and I'll actually first present our counterplan for today's debate. So a lot has been said about the human rights track record in Colombia, and we as the negation do recognize that there is room for improvement in Colombia's security forces and for improving human rights. As such, we would like to put forward the proposal that $10 million per year of additional aid will be given to the Colombian military, contingent upon the establishment of a human rights judicial commission that will investigate various instances of human rights violations and prosecute these as well. So we can see that there is a way to solve this human rights problem in Colombia that is far better than drastically and suddenly cutting off aid, a harm that I will go into in our off case. Yes?
Do you have any warrants to support that this Human Rights Commission has been successful in the past in preventing human rights and stopping human rights violations in other countries? We need to be assured that this is actually an effective
this type of
organization.
commission currently established in Colombia. The judicial willpower for actually doing this is quite low at the moment, but this monetary incentive, considering the times, can be a powerful starting point. And we have to realize the context of what we're dealing with. We were dealing with a country that saw 2 decades of instability, that saw horrible atrocities committed on both sides of the equation, and that dealing with this issue is a gradual one, and that it is going to take some time and patience. But now moving on into my opponent's first contention. Now, I would like to focus this debate on how cutting off funds will specifically affect something. Now, they've said that we are going to be, in a sense, defunding human rights violators, that we are going to be taking money out of the hands of people who commit these atrocities. Now, I'd like to point out that as a whole, the Colombian military has improved its human rights track record significantly since the 1980s conflicts that so damaged its reputation. But when we look on the other side, the FARC, that is the leftist guerrillas they were fighting, killed over 50,000 innocent people in 3 years. This is during the 1980s, of course, and that these groups continue to remain active and continue to grow drugs as a means of funding their own struggle. And the truth is, when we look at these deaths in terms of 50,000 people, we also have to consider how many people died from cocaine overdose using Colombian product that was grown in these regions. How many of those people saw lives ruined, saw their families broken apart, saw children who had no parents because their parents had died from drug overdose. And that is a cost that we must consider. And when my opponent said that, oh, I'm not really going to deal with the drug issue in Colombia, but that was and still continues to be one of the biggest issues in this country's history, and one of the biggest issues that will affect this country's future. I'm sorry, I have a lot to get through if I have time. But now we can see that we have successfully stabilized Colombia's government. The type of hostage-taking, kidnapping, extortion, and corruption that once existed has long been curbed. And we are seeing that Colombia's government is moving in a far better direction, one in which violent crime has been reduced, and the rate of production of cocaine has dramatically dropped. In 2011, Colombia no longer became the world's leading producing center of cocaine, and in fact, we have seen that anti-drug programs have worked well at eradicating various sources. Now on to their second contention, which relates to the financial cost of this. Now when I asked my POI, they simply brushed it aside at first, but I would just like to point out the importance of this. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars, and by their account, $728 million over the last 10 years, which is not a terribly large sum of money when we consider how much our government spends. But I would also like to bring something up. How much does it cost to take these drugs off the street when they are already in the United States of America? Because that is the most costly phase of the war on drugs. When inner city neighborhoods are destroyed by gangs that have funded their arsenals with drug money, when various areas are ravaged, and when people's lives are ruined when these drugs reach the United States of America, I would much rather see us spend tens of millions in Colombia on eradication efforts than spend hundreds of billions of dollars cleaning up the consequences in the United States of America. Again, if I have time. But now on to our own off-case arguments. The first of which is that these funds are badly, badly needed to fight the FARC and other drug cartels in Colombia. The FARC has up to 30,000 active members in isolated jungle areas who continue to terrorize citizens, commit acts of murder and torture, as well as other egregious human rights violations, and they also threaten the rule of law and stability in Colombia. Cutting off this aid threatens to destabilize Colombia's political situation and give the FARC a last grasp at power. It would give them the ability to jeopardize the stability of the Colombian government and the rule of law under which people have begun to live. It's clear that our strategy in Colombia of funding this type of aid has been effective, as we saw a 25% drop in cocaine production over the last 15 years, and that this is by no means the time to get stingy and cut the aid now. We are looking at the tail end of the FARC's existence, and we must ensure that they disappear from Colombia's history and that they can no longer impose the rule and cycle of violence that they once characterized themselves by. Now on to our second contention, which is that Colombia is an extraordinarily important ally that we have in the region. By ending the aid, we would sour relations with them, making them less cooperative on a wide variety of issues, including drug enforcement policy, but also negotiations with Latin American countries over issues such as trade, and that thus, when we lose this cooperation, we will invariably lose out on many future benefits of closer engagement with Colombia, such as trade, and such as possibly bettering their human rights situation, which is what our counterplan proposes. Because we as the negation argue that the best way to help Colombia fix its situation is to allow them to develop the tools to do so, instead of drastically, suddenly, and disproportionately cutting off aid to an ally who has given up so much for so long in the name of our own security. We are looking for millions of dollars per year to prevent billions that we would have to spend in the United States cleaning up the consequences of crime. So for all these reasons, I urge a strong vote in favor of the negation.
Okay, I know. Yeah. I'm fine. Get my phone out. So brief roadmap. First, I am going to go over I'm going to go off case, and then I will be going on case, and let's see. Okay, actually, you know what? I'm going to go on case and then off case. Sorry about that. Is everybody ready?
Mm-hmm.
On top of the millions of dollars that we've been giving to this country, to Colombia, since 2007, the United States has spent more than $6 billion on Plan Colombia as part of the drug war and the war on terrorism, which equates to about 80% of its military aid. As my partner stated, Colombia has received more U.S. military aid during the period than any other country outside of the Middle East. Now, this is important to realize because contrasting to the statistic my partner stated outside of this Plan Colombia, we are spending billions of dollars to Colombia. We are spending all this money, and at the end of the day, we are not resolving what our intentions are. In fact, we're actually creating a detriment. There's a net detriment to going here. So I'd like to just go over the reputations that the affirmation brought to our case. The first one of the talking about the room for improvement as the $10 billion added to a commission. So first off, there's no real structure of how this commission is going to be implemented, no real time frame. So outside of all the statistics of the commission, on case. So the statistic about the $10 billion added for the commission, there's no current commission now, and on top of that, they want to spend more money. So right away, we can see how here, in fact, they're actually spending even more money to hurt our second point, talking about the debt. And at the end of the day, we see here that that 30% of U.S. military aid is subject to human rights conditions, which is not enforced by the U.S. Department of the State. So what we see here is that the United States is okay with this. They're allowing this, and it's not being monitored at all. So assuming this would be implemented by the Department of the State, this is not going to do anything. In fact, it's going to hurt even more. Yes.
Given that you've said that our counter plan does not do anything to help human rights, can you please explain how Colombia would better its situation without U.S. military aid to clean up these efforts?
Right, so we see here that both situations aren't ideal, right? Because the affirmation and the negation, there's both going to be some net detriments. But at the end of the day, we need to see who has the most net benefits. And we see here that the affirmation absolutely has that. So I'd like to go through some other reputations that they've had. And they've talked about how cocaine has dropped, and in fact it hasn't, or it has decreased relatively, and on top of this, the negation has no evidence since 2000. So if we're looking at the current state, they only have statistics from the 1980s and no really current information. So they also brought up how and the cocaine has dropped and they're not the leading provider. And then they brought out this link to how we're bringing drugs to the United States. Yet, if they're no longer the leader in cocaine, why are we still there? If that's the big issue, if we look to Mexico and other countries which are like, you know, leaders in cocaine, why aren't we there fighting the issue? So their impact talking about like how it's so, you know, heinous and all these issues with the drug wars and how it's, you know, hurting people who are addicted to cocaine. Colombia is no longer the biggest exporter of this. So that's not even a relative issue. Also, we can make a parallelism to the way our funding to Colombia now, as we see the parallel with giving Osama bin Laden guns that he used against his own people and that he eventually used against the United States. So what we see here is that we're actually funding a group that is in fact hurting not only as hurting Colombia, and is hurting the United States relations as a whole. So going on to the second point which they had about the debt bomb. So they said it's not a lot of money. So my partner brought up millions of dollars that were being spent on other programs outside of Plan Colombia, and then the statistic about the over $6 billion being spent on Plan Colombia alone. So we see here that the debt is an immense issue, and I'm going to go over this. For the most part, all of our points flow through about the taxation without representation, the dehumanization, and all of the impacts that will have. So those flow through. They also talked about the drugs are hurting lots of people, and you know they're no longer the major distributor, so that's not a main issue. Yes, I'll take your point.
How can you begin to explain, impact, and explore Plan Colombia when your initial definitions and the initial stance on this resolution and what we were debating was the military aid portion only?
Right, so okay, so this $6 billion is in fact going to military aid. In fact, 80% of it is going to the military aid, contrasting with the, 70% is going, so the war on terrorism, which equates to 80% of the military aid. So the money that the U.S. is spending on Plan Colombia is in fact going to the military aid. I'll take your point later if I have time. So now I'd just like to go on the negations case and what they have in today's debate. So what they really have is that they're about the, that we're using this money to fight the FARC. So what we see here is that they said that there's, what this comes down to is that we're spending more money. And if we look at the judging criteria of net benefits, this is not only net benefits to Colombia, but to the United States as a whole. So our entire point about the debt flows through for the most part. They only really touch on saying that's not a lot of money, so there's not going to be an impact. So all of our impacts of the value of how the value of equality is undermined, how that the economic harm will be magnified 350% according to the Federal Reserve, and essentially its taxation without representation for future generations are all undermined. This is a terminal impact, and this completely flows through. So our second point completely stands, and they're basically, we can refute their entire part with fighting the FARC with our second point. So going on to the second point, talking about how Colombia is an important ally. So essentially, what the negation is advocating for, it's great that we're diplomatic, we're diplomatically friends. But at the end of the day, we see here that the United States is supporting child rape, massacres, and other sexual crimes such as genital mutilation. So at the end of the day, what are we really advocating for? This is a terminalized impact. This is dehumanization and death, contrasting with the diplomatic relationship with Colombia. Not only is this a terminalized impact, but they don't have any data about fighting the FARC, how many lives are really being lost. And I'd just like to go on to the Plan Colombia. So if the NEC doesn't want to discuss Plan Colombia and the impacts related to coca, then they can't absorb any benefits of eliminating coca plants and its providers. So essentially the negation is going to be hurting themselves by negating this. So once again, I'd like to go over the terminalized impacts provided by the affirmation contrasting with the negation. When looking at the affirmation, we see here the unethical use of funds, how we have billions of dollars being spent to Colombia, and it's essentially resulting in massacres, child rape, and other threats that inevitably leads into a forced displacement of the people of Colombia. And we also look at the debt, how it's not only affecting Colombia, but the United States as a whole, where we have individuals who are being taxed where we have increasing taxes on individuals in the future, and how essentially it's actually a security threat to the United States, according to Admiral Mike Mullins, who identifies the U.S. debt is the largest issue, and anything we can do to lower the debt is a net benefit. And because of that, there's a strong vote in favor of the affirmation. Thank you.
So is everyone ready?
Mhm.
Alright, so to begin, I would like to elaborate on the stance that the negation is taking in today. We believe that the best way to have an effect is to act. We clearly uphold the same value of ensuring human rights for people in Colombia and ensuring that people, the children aren't attacked or the women aren't raped. But the contrast in what we're doing is that we're actually providing money and we're actually providing resources in order for the Colombian government to enforce a better environment or a better community for the people there who they seem to care about. Now, they talked briefly about how there's no proof that this will work, but as my partner said, the money that the aid we're giving to them is contingent on the fact that it actually does work. Clearly, if it doesn't work, then we're not going to continue to provide the money. Obviously, there are set requirements for what we have to see happen for this money. Yes?
Given the ineffectiveness of even the United Nations in preventing human rights abuses, what warrants trusting this organization that hasn't
I'm
even
actually
yet been
going to
created?
address that very quickly. But I'll address that very soon. Moving on to the case that the opponents have provided today, they talked about the unethical use of money. Now, I'd like to point out that it seems the opponents have dropped many of our points. The fact is, when we look at FARCs, for example, we see that they have they do massive attacks onto the Colombian population right now. They haven't addressed this. They asked us for statistics, so I'll give you some right now. They kidnap 2,000 people every single year. They cause 4,000 deaths every single year, and they threaten government officials to take their stance, otherwise risk being murdered or assassinated. The fact is, FARCs are very present in the region right now, and the sheer fact that we're giving them money is the only way to actually combat this. That's why we need the paramilitary troops. That's why we need them to have these police organizations to actually take control of the region. Because as my partner said, Colombia was in a very dark place. It had rampant crime rates, and obviously what it needed from that to get out of that is enforcement of the law, if I have time. Now, looking on to the second issue that was kind of dropped. When we talk about drugs, the opponents asked us to talk about the benefits. That's what we've been talking about the entire debate. The fact is, Colombia is no longer the leading producer of cocaine. The National Drug Control Policy reports that Colombia's cocaine production has dropped by 25%. The reality of the situation is that when we look at cost benefits, we see that the benefits are clearly outweighing the costs in the region right now. The policies we have taken, the money we have provided, have shown to be effective in lowering crime rates, in ensuring that there's more control over groups such as the FARC, and ensuring that drug production actually goes down. Clearly, we've shown you that the United States federal government is effective in providing these aids and in ensuring that our goals are actually met. Therefore, all reasons to take the counter plan that we have provided in today's debate. Moving on from that, their second contention, once again, if I have time, is regarding the idea of debt. Now, my partner already addressed this in one point, which is that this contribution that we're providing them as a whole is not comparable to the spending or the budget that we have in our government right now. It's not going to make a big impact if we take this aid out. What will happen though, what will be a big impact, is if the region destabilizes again and we lose our trade partner, we lose all the progress that we've made thus far against drugs and against the crime that's in that area, as I'll expand on later on in our off case. We would also like to point out that there are numerous economists like Mr. Krugman from the New York Times that report that the debt is not the #1 priority right now. That using the money effectively in order to ensure that our goals, such as principles of human rights or such as ensuring that the region is stable, is much more important and much better off for the United States and other countries as a whole. We'd also like to point out that when we look at living standards, it's clear that the standard of living would actually go down if we allow the crime rates in Colombia to go back up and drug production to go back up, which would ultimately cause it to come back into the United States, putting our children more at risk later on in the future. But also when we look at morality, which is something they talked about in today's debate, when they said taxation without representation idea, it's immoral, it's inherently immoral to see that we've made progress and not act on the progress we've made. It's inherently immoral to not provide the aid that has been effective thus far and stop it off the simple, small fact that you think that the money we're spending right now is too much, especially when we've shown you that relatively it's not. Moving on from that, we would go on to our first off-case contention right now, which is regarding the fact the money is used to fight FARCs. Now, once again, as I stated already, the opponents kind of dropped this point. They talked about how we haven't provided you any clear statistics, but I have right now, The fact is the FARC play a massive impact on the community of Colombia every single day, every single year. It destabilizes the region. It puts people in a cycle of poverty. It puts them in fear. And it clearly provides massive harms. And these are all things that the affirmation is not solving for in today's debate. So when we look at both worlds, we really have to weigh this heavily against the affirmation. They don't provide any solvency. They take away the only method we have right now in ensuring that our goals are met, in ensuring that net benefits are provided. And that's clearly not in the intention of today's judging criteria. But to the second contention right now, which is regarding the fact that Colombia is an important ally. This was briefly addressed by the opponents, but to really elaborate on this, the fact is if Colombia starts to climb back up and starts to make progress, as we've seen with the lowered amount of drug production and the sharp fall in crime rates, what we ultimately get is a more important trade partner in the region, a potential trade partner for the future, which can only provide us net benefits for our economy, because as we all know, the United States' economy only improves when we have more trade partners to sell stuff to and improve our, when we have a new market to sell stuff to. But also we would point out that right now, and this really has to be the biggest voter issue, the opponents have not shown us why the aid has not been effective in lowering the amount of drug production, has not been effective in taking them out of the crime and poverty that they were in back in the 1990s. All they've shown you is that they uphold the value of human rights, but they fail to act on it. They fail to actually improve the situation. Because we better uphold the value, because we better uphold the value criterion, I urge a very strong vote in favor of the negation. Thank you.
Ready? The last 30 years have been difficult ones for Colombia, and difficult ones for the United States of America at that. Things haven't gone perfectly in either country. The US hasn't been the shining, vibrant economic power that it once was, and the human rights situation, as well as crime and even drug situation in Colombia, are far from perfect. But what we have to recognize is that without the military aid that we provide to Colombian forces, without that invaluable assistance, the situation would be far, far worse than it is today. So keeping this spirit in mind, I'll be going over the three main voter issues for the negation case here today. My first observation, as I would like to put it, is the issue of solvency. Now, my opponents have repeatedly asked in POIs, do we have any definite evidence to show that a committee that has not been established yet can possibly resurrect and solve the human rights situation in Colombia? Well, it hasn't been established yet, so no, we do not have any definite evidence of that. We do not have a concrete means to prove that the human rights abuses in Colombia will completely vanish overnight, nor do we think that they will. But we do think that the best way to bring about it is to instill more cooperation between the United States and Colombia on this issue, and to open dialogue with them by funding programs that have worked. Now, I would like to raise the similar question to my opponent's own case. In their first contention, they spelled out that they would be defunding a human rights violator. But would they be solving the human rights situation in Colombia? Could they actually do the type of work that they've accused us of being unable to do? Because frankly, as the second pro-opposition speaker said in his own words, the situation is far from ideal. There's no easy way to do this. There's no 100% clean fix to this issue. If there would be, we would have done it 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's a complicated, long-term issue. But in the affirmation world, you see a country that is isolated, that has been defunded, and that is bitter towards the United States, and that refuses to listen. And this brings me right into my first voter issue, which is about the human rights situation. Why would Colombia be more willing to cooperate with us after we've taken away its money? And furthermore, when the stability of the Colombian government is threatened because it cannot check the forces of the FARC, as we mentioned in our first contention, and that has gone largely unresponded in today's debate, how can you ensure that the FARC will not step in and commit the horrible atrocities that they committed? I don't like to play games of addition and subtraction with lives, but my opponents mentioned that there were two 50,000 murders committed by paramilitary groups within Colombian security forces. That is a huge number, and that is an unfortunately high number. But 50,000 murders committed by FARC forces is far more. And I'd rather see a government that is willing to reform itself and that is willing to strive towards meaningful change than a takeover by hostile parties that are only interested in filling their pockets with drug money. So on to my next voter issue, which is about the drug issue in Colombia. My opponents in their first speech largely neglected it, and in their second they tried to make this about Plan Colombia. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about aid to the Colombian military, and it is relevant that we claim those impacts, because the Colombian military has been the enforcer at the forefront of this battle. And on one side, they've said that, well, our whole contention about stemming the production of drugs is refuted by the fact that it's going to cost money to do it in Colombia. But as I already mentioned in my first speech, we're going to save money in the long term, because stopping drugs before they're produced is far cheaper than taking them off the streets after, and it keeps our communities far, far safer. These impacts, which my partner and I have gone over, really do protect human rights in this situation. They protect the human rights of people around the world, including in the United States. And that's a key voter issue here today, that these drugs have been responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of people, and if we want to stem that production and stem the horrible situation that cocaine has created in our country, then this must be part of it. Now on to my final voter issue, which is the long-term stability of Colombia and the effects of that. My opponents, again, have said that their money situation outweighs this, that their second contention refutes our whole argument about this being necessary to check the power of the FARC. I do not understand how spending several $100 million and how that could possibly balloon a $17 trillion deficit refutes the fact that the FARC are still active, that they do have an actionable military force that is funded, that is armed, and that is trained. And if we want to see a country move away from the near civil war that it saw in the 1980s, if we want to see the FARC disappear into irrelevance, which we ought to, then you must go with the negation counterplan here today. We must see this deal through. We must see the conflict in Colombia to an end, because there is a clear and present danger. And the worst case scenario on the negation side is that maybe you don't completely eliminate the FARC overnight. But the worst case situation on the affirmation side is you see a Colombia whose government has a new name. And that is something that is far, far too dangerous for today's debate. So for all these reasons, I urge a strong vote in favor of the negation.
Is everyone ready? All right, I'd like to thank everyone for the final time for making this debate possible, and the motion is finally, the United States federal government should end its military aid to Colombia. Now, as I begin my speech, I'd first like to commend my partner and my opponents on their brilliant speaking and eloquence when conducting this debate round. But in this speech, I'm going to go straight down to what's on the flow, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on, because I think it's the argumentation in this round that is going to decide whether the ballot should go to the AF or nay. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the human rights violations and whether or not we can solve them. Now, first of all, the negation brushed over evidence of not just death, but rape and torture. They stated that they actually justified the funding of human rights violations by stating that removing the aid would, quote, sour our relationship, unquote, with the country of Colombia. Then they went so far as to say that by increasing funding, we're going to be able to basically, we're going to be able to bring an end to the organization of the FARCs. But the only evidence that they brought up this entire round that supports the idea that the FARCs can, will, or are in the process of being stopped was the evidence that they showed from the 1980s that the military of Colombia was able to stop the FARCs. Now, we stated, give us more statistics, give us more facts, give us more reasons to believe that you're able to solve this, but they haven't been able to do that throughout this round. They've told us what the FARCs have done that's so terrible, and we agree that that's horrendous. These atrocities can't just be ignored, but they also can't be increased. And the fact that they have still not given us evidence that our military funding towards Colombia has done anything to stop the FARCs or anything to stop the human rights violations of the Colombian military is reason enough to vote against the negation team. I'm sorry, not at this time. Hopefully later in my speech. I'll make sure to ask you before I end my speech. So we can see that when we look to the amount of evidence in today's debate, we do have evidence showing that we are directly funding the organizations that are raping, murdering, mutilating people in Colombia. We have those. Those are tangible facts that we know in this round, are that those people are being victimized as a result of the funding that the United States federal government is giving towards these organizations. However, the only information to suggest that we might possibly be able to bring an end to the FARC is that 30 years ago, the Colombian military did something that kind of hurt the FARC a little bit, but that was before we were funding them. That was 30 years ago. The country's been through many political changes, many leadership changes. We have absolutely no reason to believe that they have any solvency whatsoever. And then, moreover, they state that this funding isn't going to link to the disadvantages that we have of the funding to Colombia, because they're going to have this human rights organization, and they say, well, we might not solve everything, but we're going to solve something. But that's not necessarily true. And with POI, I stated that even the United Nations is incapable of stopping human rights violations all over the world. What leads us to believe that this other organization is going to do anything? And they don't give us a response, and we understand that they had 20 minutes of prep time, but 20 minutes of prep time is not only not enough time to come up with that information, but it's certainly not enough time to establish that some unknown organization is going to be able to do anything, and that's why we can't vote for it. We can only vote in this round for things that we know, given the information that we've been given in this round, could be effective, are going to be effective, and with the tangible impacts that we have in this round. So what we see is that on the affirmative side of this debate, we're going to be ending the funding that directly links to the death and dehumanization of the people of Colombia. On the negation side of this round, we're going to be funding those groups, and we're probably not going to be doing anything about the FARC. And then they get into the drugs, the issue of the drugs. They say that ending the entrance of drugs into the United States is worth all the bad impacts that we have. But they haven't quantified the drug issue in the United States or in Colombia. They haven't showed us why the drugs are bad for Colombia when that's their economy. They haven't shown us why the drugs in the United States are worse than the fact that we're taxing people without the representation, the fact that we're going to put future generations into another depression. And they like to minimize these impacts because this is only a small part of the debt. But we have to see that in this round, not only do we have to say no to the fact that one member of that half of this debate in here wants to be okay with these human rights violations because we might have better trade relationships with the country, but we have to say no to the idea that it's okay to increase the debt at the cost of future generations. So when we're looking to the United States social contract on top of these human rights violations, we see that the negation is violating the social contract. They're not only taking tax-paying dollars from citizens of the United States, past, present, and future, to fund these human rights violations, but they're wasting this money while destroying the lives of future generations in the United States. Now, we've given statistics and facts about what the state of our government is right now and what the debt is and how this is going to affect the future, and they've done nothing to solve for it. They've stated, well, this is only a small part of it, but we have to attack the small parts. We have to say no to these violations of our social contract, and we have to say no to these violations of human rights all over the world, and this is the first step we can take, and whether you take that or not in this round is how you're going to cast your ballot. So I urge a vote in favor of the affirmative. Very proud to affirm. Thank you.
Great job.
Great.
Good job.
Thank you for judging.
I wouldn't shake my hand right now.
Oh, everyone seems
I'm
to be
not
sick.
contagious. It's just I blew my nose and I haven't washed my hands yet.
Oh, thank you for judging.
RFD.
Yeah, so we're not going to give an RFD because Tab told us not to. We can give comments.
Yeah.
Right. Do you want to record those part?
The comment part?
Yeah.
I don't care either way.
All right.
Oh, your paradigm, sorry. I meant paradigm. To like shake your hand.
Okay, I've never been recorded giving comments before. Alright, I guess I'll start neg, then app. Okay, so firstly on the CP. Okay, it was way too vague. You're saying $10 million in aid contingent upon whether or not it works, but you have no warrants or analysis for why it's going to work, just the notion that, okay, we're not going to give them money if it doesn't work, so it kind of defaults at some point or another into kind of this circular reasoning that, okay, if it works, we're going to give them money, if it doesn't work, we're not going to give them money, and then if it doesn't work, the extra money isn't going to be given, and none of the benefits you're stating throughout the entire case are going to be realized. So that completely defaults. And additionally, you handle that very well with your POI about the UN, how it fails to have peacekeeping forces elsewhere, how it's not going to be stabilized, and you even admit in your final speech that we don't know whether or not this is going to work. there are empirical examples that you could have tried to maybe bring up, or maybe some kind of logical analysis that there's going to be training given to some of the people involved. Oh shoot, I didn't put down speaks. Hold on a sec. That there could be training given to some of the people involved. I mean, there's other things that you could have done that would have made it a little bit better in this case. One second, just writing down speaks. Okay, there's definitely a better way you can handle it. Then on to the drug contention. That also could have been handled a lot more cleanly. So I understand what you're getting at, that okay, the FARC's bad and that the FARC's worse than these paramilitaries. At the end of the day though, I'm left with some tangible harms from the paramilitaries and versus some potential ethereal solutions from the too vague counter plan. What I was getting on to the judge before I lost my train of thought. Okay. Again, no warrants or proof as to why suddenly giving $10 million in aid is going to end up improving the battle against drugs. Secondly, there's a lot of analysis and literature out there specifically in giving military aid to Colombia that one, it would be a better use of U.S. funds to try and put that into treatment programs in Colombia and actually try and develop a better source of infrastructure and economic revenue to the people there so that they wouldn't need to turn to cultivating drugs for money and wouldn't be held hostage by the FARC. There's a lot of different ways you could have implemented that, and I think it would have actually been a really smart move if you want to keep diplomatic relations with Colombia to say, okay, we'll continue to give them aid, but we're not going to give it to their military because the military is funding rape and torture. And there is a lot of, I mean, you're correct with what you're saying. The paramilitary groups are funding a lot. There's a lot of problems with them. The other issue is that because they're regional, they're more easily spread out than, say, the giant organization of the FARC. So you could have impacted that more. That would have been more dangerous. Also, it's a little bit more insidious because it's their local police force. And that's mainly what people are trying to beef up when they give even some form of military aid. They're trying to beef up the local situation. So at the point that even the local institutions can't be trusted, we really can't make the problem worse before we figure out how to identify and fix it. Really quickly on your response to, because I know I'm talking a ton, on your response to the whole debt and helping them and helping out Colombia in general. Okay, I'm not sure if you've ever gotten this before, but morality isn't really a valid refutation. One, because this is a policy round. Two, because there's many different interpretations of morality. And thirdly and finally, it was not very well refuted. I mean, you mentioned that, okay, the $728 million that they're giving isn't very much money. That's countered by $6 billion with the Plan Colombia, which actually, maybe this is just me misunderstanding, but I thought that Plan Colombia was the free trade agreement that got ratified back in May between the U.S. and Colombia, not a drug, not specifically a military drug part of it. Maybe I missed part of some kind of military aid that was in there. That was
What we found was that
it was for the drug war and the war on terrorism.
Okay, so that's so it's something different. It might not necessarily be Plan Colombia.
Okay.
There's that. Also, you don't counter their analysis that any kind of extra spending is going to be harmful very well. They're also saying that this is a decently significant amount of spending. They impacted out relatively well in the round with less quality of life, more dehumanization, misrepresentation. By the way, I wasn't a particular fan of this particular kind of a contention, considering the round was about Colombia. I would have been a lot more open to hearing more things about how military aid ends up worsening the drug war. I mean, you definitely could have talked about that way more, but you ended up making the contention work for you, and that's all I really have to vote on it. Overall, nice job. Oh, one quick thing. Put the plan text at the beginning. Put your plan text at the beginning of your speech versus kind of in the middle here. And there were a couple times when it would have been more helpful had you signposted more with your reputations and you kind of flip-flop around on the page. Same thing with you guys, both in your construction and in your reputations.
Yeah, sorry about that. I had so many papers up there.
I
was
understand.
kind of lost.
I mean, it's tricky.
Yeah.
Did someone get ballots already?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I just have one question, is that okay?
Sure.
About, like, if we were to say that we would encourage, like, non-military aid for development, Would that be mutually exclusive on our side?
Mutually exclusive?
Like, could
on
it be
the side?
perm?
Well, I mean,
Like, or would we be subject to them?
it would be a potential, I suppose.
I would argue that if you ran a counterplan that said, like, cut military aid, but put more money to humanitarian or whatever, right? I don't think that's mutually exclusive, but I do think that's potentially competitive on net benefits, in that the counterplan by itself can outweigh the perm, because the counterplan by itself, as opposed to the perm, wouldn't bite all the dishats of
I think it'd at
military
least
strat.
knock out our second contention very well.
And that. So I think it's still potentially strategic on net benefits competition.
I think it would have been a better implementation of the CP. That's all I have.
Alright, so since I can't give an RFD, I'll just say random thoughts that are in my head about this round or anything tangentially related to it. So first of all, there was that blip, or like, the standard for this round was somewhat unclear. I got like the social contract, but not on top of the case, just somewhere in the contentions. And then I got net benefits, but also I got like net benefits only to the US from you guys in like one sentence at some point on the reputations, which if I bought that, and I'm not going to say which one I bought, would take out like 90% of the arguments in this round, just that one sentence. So I thought people would spend more time on it, and you guys just like didn't talk about it.
Yeah, I thought I
again,
got net
and you guys
benefits
didn't
at
talk
the
about it
beginning of my
again.
speech, but I thought I got net benefits at the beginning of my first speech, but I might not.
But I also
make
like
that
net
clear.
benefits, like there were specific like net benefits only to the US, I think in your speech.
Yeah.
Um,
I was trying to like
which
say.
is a pretty like important
Yeah.
to say,
Yeah,
because
I don't know
that
if I can
there's a
do
bunch of stuff that don't link to that standard. But you guys just don't spend time on that, which I think is not very strategic. I think that your second point about how Colombia is an important or trade ally and so on is a good thing to explore, but you don't actually make the argument in that I don't really get concrete impacts of what would happen to our trade, right? So you just sort of say, and that could potentially be a problem, but you never actually explain what would happen if we cut off aid. Will Colombia, let's say, will Colombia leave the free trade agreement, right? Because they get pissed at us. What will they do? Like, what will the impact be exactly? So I think that you need to do better impacting analysis on that. But that being said, you guys were really great speakers. This is the highest speaking points I gave this entire tournament. And this tournament has a lot of other great speakers, so you should be proud. Other things, so on the weighing of who's worse, FARC or like the right-wing paramilitaries, I just thought you guys may be interested. So there was a recent WikiLeaks cable that was released, which was a letter from the embassy in Bogota sent to the United States, which estimated the death toll from the Colombian War and attributed responsibility, which said that the death toll was about 250,000 people, which is quite high. And of that, about 94% was attributed to the right-wing paramilitaries, which means FARC would be a minority, although it said that FARC was also responsible. I don't know the methodology of that. My understanding was that these were like internal embassy figures, so the methodology wasn't provided, but that's just an interesting thing to look into.
Thank you.
On the counterplan, I think the counterplan was strategic to run, but could have been better implemented. And there have probably been times before when we conditioned aid on human rights, so you can, if you want to write that counterplan, find some example of when that worked and be like, we're modeling this on United States aid to, I don't know, some country, right? And the work in that country. So find some like solvency evidence and details, because that would be, like, it's a smart thing to do, you're just not doing it well. Other thing, so on the spending argument.
This is the debt one?
Yeah, the debt
Okay.
one. I think the explanation, I'm just bugged by economic explanations, because that's like my area of interest.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk about that.
Okay.
So there are two arguments that I'm bugged by. The first argument is the attempted turn that you do to the debt or defense, whatever that was, in terms of like Krugman says the debt is fine, which is true, right? Like there is a number of economists who say that our debt is not a major problem, basically all Keynesian economists. The issue, however, is that what Krugman advocates specifically is that we borrow money and then we put it back into our economy to like create jobs, right? And thus stimulate the economy, which is different from borrowing money and sending it abroad, because the money you send abroad does not have a stimulative effect. It may have a stimulative effect in Colombia, but definitely not here, right? And so in that sense, like Krugman isn't saying like debt is just good for the sake of debt. He's saying debt is good because we can deficit finance to like have jobs programs and reduce unemployment. The issue that I have with you guys on the explanation of the economic argument, which is not a major issue in the round, but it's just that people say that a lot and it bugs me, is like that whole thing about like our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, that hit my pathos on the. In my paragraph says I hate pathos, and there is a little bit much of it in this round for me.
Okay.
But also it's just factually correct.
Yeah.
Like most of our debt is bought by U.S. citizens, which means that like we will have to pay it back
To ourselves.
to like people with retirement accounts, for instance. So I, as a child, will have my grandpa who is not starving, you know, because he's getting paid interest on his treasury bonds. So it's like some subset of people paying back to another subset of people, which
Okay.
within America, at least the majority of it. So I don't see that as a true argument.
Okay, so that I know that was probably far of a stretch, but did
the
you
best
buy?
response we've heard so far. Thank you.
Did
I
you
like
buy
that.
like taxation without representation?
Yeah, but like just well, to some extent.
Yeah.
Tenuously. I mean, I'm sympathetic to what you were saying in that they're making really large claims with a pretty small link. I mean, like I said, you made it work for you in this round. However, it's just kind of a dubious thing to run in general.
Okay. I know you really wanted to be specifically about Colombia, and we kind of brought it to the United States.
No. I mean, it's fine to talk about U.S. implications. I mean, that's a valid thing in the round. It's just it was a little bit tenuous.
Okay.
Is what I'm getting at.
All right.
If you talked about like interdiplomatic relations with Colombia as well with the U.S., I think that might have had a slightly stronger link.
Okay. Great.
Any questions?
How is my speaking style?
I would say that you need to do a better job at signposting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for instance, you said that I think you said you're starting in the AC,
Yeah, I
but
was.
then like most of the first half of your speech actually started flowing in the NC because
Okay.
that seemed more responsive, and you as you were going through the NC, you just offhandedly answered their counterplan. So yeah, like signposting.
This was a little hard. Oh, one really quick thing on the right-wing paramilitaries. There was a study 1 or 2 years ago that actually showed problems, one with integration, which could have been something else you brought up against their counterplan of this UN monitoring thing. The issue was that they had a lot of paramilitaries that they reintegrated into the general Colombian army, dress up bodies as members of the FARC and try and turn them in for like ransom, not ransom, but
Wait,
for
they dress
the
who up?
bounty. Bodies of the deceased
Oh.
were dressed up as the FARC and then turned in for the bounty that you get for killing FARC members or something along those lines. So that one shows problems with integration. I know, right? 2, corruption within the Colombian government and the status quo. And thirdly, why we really don't want to fund a military solution.
Okay.
Yeah, I've heard about that. That also can indicate that the evidence that we're effective at fighting FARC can also mean that we're effective at dressing up dead bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Possibly the dead bodies of civilians we kill.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Great. Well, thank you very much, judges.
Kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
Yeah.